Seattle newspaper. But people just responded like crazy. And in 24 hours, they raised $12,000. And so I think this is an example of what I sort of call locally sourced science. If you have a question that the community cares about, Dan Jaffe didn't have 700 Facebook friends. Dan Jaffe doesn't have, Neil deGrasse Tyson's following. He probably doesn't have any social media presence at all. But he's working in an area where there's a huge community that exists that's waiting to kind of be activated by, experimentation. So he says, I'm qualified to do these experiments. Seattle Times gives him a megaphone, even if only briefly, but it was enough that people just went crazy for it. So if you dig into the numbers a little deeper, you can see, so using Google Analytics, you can see how, where are people finding out about his website? Where are they coming from? So it turns out about a quarter of his traffic was coming from direct traffic, so he was probably sending out direct emails to people with a link to the project. And that's obviously, anyone who's doing a campaign like this should just simply take their address book and basically spam out all their contacts. But then they had this, about 20% came from Seattle Times, which was all coming from in that 48-hour period in the aftermath of that little local news blog post. Another chunk, about 20%, came from this blog called Cliff Mass. It's a weather blog that's very specific to the Pacific Northwest. And it's a guy named Cliff Mass who runs it. And he started blogging about this from the beginning. And so you see, and then you got a piece coming from Facebook, and a piece coming from Google searching. So in the end, if you actually look at all the donors, 75% of them came from the Seattle area. So it really was a project that mattered to this local community, and they responded when a scientist said, I can answer this question using the scientific method. And again, he's not partisan, he doesn't really care what the outcome is, he just wants to do the experiment. And people are like, yeah, we like this idea. And it turned out that he had a very difficult time convincing traditional grant agencies to even fund this idea. Maybe for political reasons, people were worried about the train lobby or whatever it was. But this is an example where crowdfunding really actually pragmatically made a lot of sense. Not just because it was a cool idea, he actually had no other alternative. And one way to think about crowdfunding campaigns is in terms of their conversion rates. So any kind of marketing campaign you want to know, how many people did I bring to the web page, and then how many actually did what I wanted them to do. So in this case, conversion rate is determined as the number of donors, say in a 24-hour period, and the number of page views to the donation page in that same period. And what was really remarkable is that, so this is looking at, so I told you it took 11 days for Dan Jaffe to raise his money. So right out of the gate, he was already having more than 1% conversion rate, almost 2%. Now generally, the rule of thumb is for crowdfunding, if you get a 1% conversion rate, that's good, right? So you get 100 page views, one of those will end up being a donor. He was already getting more than 1%. In fact, he never had below 1%. And that, I think, was attributable to the fact that this weather blogger was already talking about him from day one. So that already was giving him an audience that was probably primed to care about this issue. And then you see this enormous surge on the day of the Seattle Times piece. 8% conversion rate. I've never seen a conversion rate that high. So there's about 1,500 page views came through. We almost had 150 donors. So people who were reading that article were like, I love this idea, I'm going to fund it. So these are all sort of, maybe some of the cynics out here are saying, well, in the biomedical world, again, $18,000, $25,000, it's just not enough, I had a lab at Princeton for 5 years. The average monthly burn rate, how much I was spending every month was $17,000. So yeah, this is great, but in the real world, you couldn't support biomedical research for more than a shorter period of time. Well, here's an example of a campaign raising 10 times what we raised. In fact, they raised almost $400,000. So there were two campaigns on Indiegogo. One of them was called the American Gut Project. One was called U-Biome. They were both focused on this hot topic called the microbiome, right? So everyone's got these bacteria that live in various parts of your body. And so these projects, so the American Gut was set up by a bunch of academics who study like microbiomes normally. And they were like, you know what? Let's kind of do what 23andMe did. So people know what 23andMe is. So 23andMe is the personal genomics company. They send you a little tube, you spit in it, and they look at your genomic variation, for you, and they can tell you things about your ancestry. They can tell you things about health risks, et cetera, et cetera. So they were like, let's do the same thing, except not just your host, your genome, but like let's look at the genomes of all those critters that live inside your gut. And so they essentially did pre-sales for this kit, for sequencing your microbiome, and they were selling them, each kit was like $99. And so they're doing basic science because no one knows anything about the microbiome, right? But the kind of catch is it's not purely basic science. It's not like our project is like the results are going to be, where does the methamphetamine go? That's going to be But in this case, we're going to sell you this kit, and in exchange, we'll tell you what's in your microbiome. And so this is to tell you, though, that if you are able to sort of make a product, although I don't think that's going to be scalable, because you don't want basic research by definition doesn't necessarily have a product. So this is not going to work, in all cases. But in this one case where you can kind of swing it so that you can make your basic research about selling a product, it's possible to even raise what are traditionally considered the amounts of money that are needed to do biomedical research, $250,000, $300,000. This is the amount that you get from an R1 grant, which is the workhorse grant that the NIH gives to individual academics running labs. And so you can see that our campaign looks like a drop in the bucket compared to their campaign. And you can see this even more clearly if you take each of these circles now represents 1 day's worth of fundraising. And you can see here was our plot, and this is a log scale. So you can see everything was shifted up tenfold. So a typical day for them, they were raising several $1,000s. Now how they did this, it's interesting. Lots of people out there care about the microbiome. There's lots of people, for example, who care about the paleo diet. And so they probably heard about it, sort of like, oh, this is cool. A lot of people are part of something called the quantified self movement. People who are like measuring things about themselves. So this was like, yeah, it's great, let me try this. So they couldn't have done this just from, spamming their Facebook. It's just not possible to raise this money. Unless you're friends only with like, the Google founders or the PayPal mafia. It's not gonna happen. So this is clearly all driven by just general interest in the community for this kind of scientific research. So on that note, I'll just open it up to questions, and thank you for your time.